This is the BBC.
This podcast is supported by advertising outside the UK.
BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
As I was going to Derby all on a market day, I spied the biggest ramser that ever was fed on A, and indeed...
Hello, I'm Geeta Pensay and welcome to Derby's Marketplace, right in the heart of the city centre. I'm standing by an impressive sculpture of a ram which is covered in tiny mirrors and looks like a ram-shaped disco ball. It's one of 30 giant fiberglass figures that form the Derby Ram Art Trail, which runs through the city till the 22nd of August. And they're based on the mythical Derby ram, which, according to the 18th century song, was 10 yards high with enormous horns and a flowing fleece. It's also the mascot of the football club Derby County, also known as the Rams. In this special edition of Front Row, I'll be heading to the club to meet its poet-in-residence, Jamie Thrasavulu. I'll also be looking at a new National Trust project which explores the links between Britain's colonial history and its great country houses. The grand estate in the case of Derby is Kedleston Hall, designed by 18th century architect Robert Adam. But first, I'll be heading to another 18th century building, the Derby Silk Mill, regarded as the first modern factory in the world and now home to the new Museum of Making.
Same as I, and indeed, sir, it's true, sir, I never was given to lie. And if you'd have been to Derby, you'd have seen him the same as I.
I'm outside the Museum of Making, which is on the banks of the River Derwent, surrounded by a really busy ring road, and towering in front of me is the historic red brick silk mill. Emerging by its side, a new glass frontage which is part of an £18 million reinvention which sets out to celebrate 300 years of industrial history in Derby. Of course, they're opening during a pandemic when museums have had all kinds of restrictions and pressures. I'm going to meet Tony Butler, the man who led the team who believed if they could build it, the public would come.
The museum does explore 300 years of manufacturing in our city. So we are situated in Derby Silk Mill, thought to be the site of the world's first factory, built in 1721. So we're celebrating our 300 years anniversary this year. And it's a legacy that's gone right through 3 centuries, from early cloth manufacturing to the arrival of the railways in the 19th century, aeronautics in the early 20th century, and the high-tech industries today.
The Museum of Making opened in May as part of an £18 million reinvention of a museum that used to be here but closed 10 years ago. So what was that museum like?
So the Derby Industrial Museum was opened in 1974, and it gave a fairly comprehensive history of industry in the city. I mean, I'd say it was probably quite a great man view of industrialisation and manufacturing in the city. It was set up at a time when we were just in the throes of deindustrialisation and, in the 70s, coming to terms with what a post-industrial country would look like. And to a degree that meant that what the museum represented was loss. And the museum, over time, declined in visitor numbers and interest, and by the time we got to 2011, when the museum was mothballed by the city council, numbers had dwindled quite a bit.
Having lost that sense of connection to the city by the time the old museum closed, how did you go about creating something new here?
The big catalyst was bringing in a inspirational project director, so Hannah Fox, who's been the project director of the Museum of Making for nearly a decade. Earlier I talked about this sort of sense of deindustrialisation. Manufacturing still happens here, and it happens in high-tech industries. So some of the salaries in Derby are the highest in the country because we've got 3 big employers: Rolls-Royce, Toyota, and Alstom. Bombardier was the Midland Railway. So planes, trains and automobiles made here. So we've got a city full of engineers, full of technicians and full of makers. So Hannah took that great groundswell that we had, and we began to build community around this idea of a kind of new iteration for the museum. So we work with makers, hackers, tinkerers, people working in their sheds, people who might be in white-collar jobs in manufacturing companies that began on the shop floor and just wanted to get hands-on. So back in 2013, we built what was called our prototype phase, and we kitted out a workshop with CNC machines, laser cutters, 3D printers, so that we could build a new community for the site around making. So ensuring that the actual physical making and materiality were going to be central to the new iteration of the museum.
It's called the Museum of Making, but do you think the artistry of manufacturing is properly recognised? Is this what this museum is about?
Absolutely. So the craft of making, the beauty of casting, or the intricacies of detail on everyday objects is absolutely manifest in the things that you can see in this museum. Now, one of the important aspects of the museum was to emphasise less the story of manufacturing, but the materiality of manufacturing. That's what a museum, for me, is all about. It's about those objects and the stories that come from those objects.
What can you see when you visit the museum?
Ceramics, Royal Crown Derby, a real legacy company for the city. There's textiles, from original silk that was made in the factory from the 1720s right up to companies like Hoob that are based in the city and who are clothing triathletes during the Olympics. You can see glassware. You can see things that you wouldn't necessarily think were made of materials from an end product. So ceramic blades in the Rolls-Royce engine, they speak to a legacy of ceramic makers in the city, but those materials are absolutely integral to an object that's ostensibly made of metal. So people will be able to make connections across that materials taxonomy and to see that what goes into objects, it's not just one material, there's a whole range of those things.
You are challenging that great men of industry narrative. Were you worried about upsetting perhaps people who expect a more traditional view of industry?
We did quite a lot of research to begin with, and we felt that taking a broader view of industry, as I said, based on materiality, would land with visitors.
It has been such a challenging time for museums generally. What is it like to open a new museum during a pandemic?
So we opened in the last week of May, and I think there was a sense of relief that something new was happening in the city just as things began to open up again. We've obviously had to restrict the numbers of people coming into the museum. We've had distancing regime in place. It's been unfortunate also that we've not been able to fully roll out our programmes of making, because the whole beauty of the experience of coming to the museum is to look at these fantastic collections, but also to get hands-on, to participate in making activities in our workshop, in our studios. And we've unfortunately not been able to run as many of those programmes as we'd like. That said, we were imagining about 15,000 visitors in that first couple of months, and we've more or less hit that, so we're really, really pleased at that. In that first year of operations, our original business plan we thought was fairly conservative. We were looking at about 140,000 over the year, and we might not hit that, but we'll be near 100,000, which isn't, I don't think it's too shabby in a pandemic.
Tony Butler there, Director of Derby Museums. Now it's time for some football.
We are Derby, where the future's bright, black and white. Whoever the opponent, we'll take a fight. We'll sing the songs, we'll sing them loud. Whatever gets thrown at us, the ambition's here, the time is now. Our loyal supporters will see us proud. Without a new blue, we can make the push and forge new histories to elevate this club back to the top, where we belong. The ambition here is bubbling strong. We are Derby!
That is Jamie Thrasavulu, poet in residence at Derby County Football Club, reciting his poem We Are Derby to a delighted audience of footy fans. Jamie's currently working on a play to celebrate the club's historic FA Cup win in 1946. It was the first cup final after the Second World War and a moment of glory for the city. Well, I'm at the home of the Rams to meet Jamie.
So currently we're sat in the South Stand, and this is the quietest you will ever see the South Stand, or hear the South Stand, should I say. This is where our more enthusiastic supporters tend to congregate and hold their season tickets and generate the atmosphere in the stadium. It all sort of starts here. So yeah, it's weird to be here with it being so quiet, but I always love being in the South Stand. Yeah.
It is eerily quiet, but I can imagine what it's like when you've got those 33,000 people roaring and supporting the team. You are the poet in residence here. How did that happen?
It was when Frank Lampard came in as our manager. He only stayed for a season, but he brought with him his media and communications team, and they were looking to raise the atmosphere to another level on match day. So they wanted to commission a poet, and Rams TV had already been made aware of my work through the Punjabi Rams Association. Actually, I did a gig for the Joe Cox Memorial Foundation to celebrate, we have more in common than that which divides us, and that was on Normanton Park. And the Friends of Normanton Park asked me on the day if I would chalk up a stanza of a poem onto a chalkboard that they have in the park. And then one of the Punjabi Rams Association were walking their dog in the park, took a photo of it, tagged Derby County and Rams TV into it, and said, this guy's a nationally renowned poet and he's a massive Derby County fan. You lot are missing a trick here, kind of thing. And then a couple of weeks later, I got the email through, and they says, would you like to write a poem for Derby County? And I was like, is the sky blue? So yeah, and the rest is kind of history from there, really. It was something I'd always dreamed of. I can't deny that I maybe tried to manifest it, because in 2016, I remember I said to my friend at the time, I said, my ambition is to be Derby County's first ever poet in residence. And I didn't know how that was going to happen, but I always held this desire to do it, and I suppose a hope for it. And then when it came along, I was like, okay, it's happening.
And you wrote the poem We Are Derby, which has been a real hit with fans. What inspired that?
I basically looked at the things that Derby has to be proud of, and that's our heritage and our history, and obviously our footballing history as well. We're a founding member of the Football League, centre of the Industrial Revolution. Florence Nightingale plotted her vision for what we now see in terms of nursing. There's so much going on in Derby, and Derby historically hasn't been that great at celebrating it. So I wanted to create a poem that celebrated our rich cultural history, and also, says something about the football club and just gets us ready for a match. Not all the fans have taken to it, obviously. That's impossible. You can't please everybody with a subjective art form. But yeah, it's been a real honour.
On match day, when you're right in the centre with all the fans around you, what's it like as a poet to deliver your words?
Very hard. There isn't a tougher gig than performing a poem in a football stadium, and I defy anybody who says there is a tougher gig, because there isn't. I never knew that I had the level of performance that I've now discovered I have until I got thrown into the cauldron that first time on December the 17th, 2019 against Nottingham Forest, and they're our biggest rivals, and they actually allocated a few more away tickets than normal, so there are over 3,000 Nottingham Forest fans, and as soon as I started the poem, they all started chanting a certain expletive at me that isn't suitable for radio, and that just spurred me on more, because I don't want Nottingham Forest fans to like the poem. If Nottingham Forest fans liked the poem, I'm doing something wrong, and there's no way I was losing that battle. So yeah, I just cracked on doing the poem, and they got bored of trying to champ me down by the time the poem had finished.
And Jamie, you're writing something else at the moment, also about your beloved Rams. Tell me about that.
Yeah, so I'm working on a play called Extra Time. Well, it's more a show than a play. It's not a straight three-act play. It's sort of an amalgamation of different art forms. So it's going to have sort of poetry in it. It's going to have some acting, scene type stuff, some monologues, some music, some dance and movement.
What do you focus on in the play?
I suppose the focal point starts in 1946 when Derby County won the FA Cup. And it was the first FA Cup since the Second World War. And Derby won it. We beat Charlton Athletic in the final. And the game itself had a lot of drama, which I know a lot of people will be aware of. I probably won't say too much about it, just in case some people who might come and watch the play aren't aware of it, and then they can learn it through the play. It also goes on into more current history, and it celebrates other eras of success, such as the Brian Clough and Peter Taylor era, where we won 2 titles. and, you know, played in Europe and beat Real Madrid at the baseball ground. And then it will go into sort of the Jim Smith era again, you know, when his team got us promoted back to the Premiership. And it also incorporates the general sort of feeling of Derby being an underdog city that works hard and, you know, maybe doesn't have as many victories as some of the bigger cities, but those victories we have mean a lot to us. Basically, what springboarded it was the fact that it's 75 years since we won. So it's kind of a celebration of 75 years since we went to Wembley, beat a London team and came away with the cup. And we've never won the cup since, you know. So it's I think it's nice to remember your achievements as a football club, a city, and what it means to the city.
And maybe putting it out there again into the universe, another FA Cup win in the future.
I'd love to think that. Yeah, let's put it out there, let's manifest it. You know, we're all about manifestation, so yeah, let's go for that.
We've travelled a few miles out of the city centre to the serene and pastoral grounds of Kedleston Hall. Erected in the mid-18th century as a temple to the arts, it's a grand and opulent building. It's the kind of place when I was growing up that I felt a mix of awe but also discomfort. As a British Indian, I was aware of objects acquired during the Empire, but felt like the full story about where they came from was hidden. National Trust has decided that the time has come to excavate the colonial histories of some of these great country houses with its project Colonial Countryside, which involves commission writers, historians and school pupils exploring the contents and the creation of these houses. One of those writers is Masuda Snaith, a novelist and short story writer who was paired with Kedleston Hall and chose objects in the house for inspiration for her flash fiction.
I'm from Leicester and Kedleston's in Derbyshire was another, I think it may be Chalk Abbey, but I still can't remember which one it was. And that's the only experience I had of one of those kind of big National Trust properties. And I remember going there and just feeling like this has nothing to do with me or my history or where I come from. That was my main experience. I had never been to Kedleston itself or knew any of its history or the connection to India.
I've been to Kedleston and there's just so much that draws the eye. And one of the fascinating things is that the family, they created their own museum called the Eastern Museum. Was that something that you were drawn to?
It was really interesting because when I was taken on a tour of Kedleston Hall, it's kind of the last place we went into. And at that time, it wasn't open to the public, so all the shutters were closed and it was all very mysterious. And we kind of go into the basement and the doors are open and there's this fantastic and kind of bizarre museum of Indian goods, and there's ivory thrones and tusks and an elephant foot and all of this weaponry and jewellery, and it was quite overwhelming because the rest of the hall is very traditional kind of Roman inspired architecture, and then there's this kind of almost secret, like you say, private museum that is just full of this stuff that is connected to my history.
So you just named a few things that you had spotted. Was it quite hard to land upon an object that you would then be inspired to write about?
It was difficult because a lot of the stuff in the Eastern Museum isn't labelled with modern labelling, it's still Victorian, so there's very little written about a lot of the objects. And then George Nathaniel Curzon, who was Viceroy of India and is the main connection, who brought back all this stuff, but also all the people involved and all his family and the people who would have worked for him. And that's the route I decided to take. So I was going to write 10 flash fiction pieces, so below 1,000-word short stories. And I thought instead of focusing on Curzon, who has had quite a lot of stuff written about him already, I would look at the people who were connected to him from the voices that you wouldn't normally hear and kind of connect to the objects via those people.
And one of those perspectives is through the perspective of an ayah, which was an Indian nanny employed by British families when they were, in India and different parts of the colony. I'd love to hear an extract from it. It's called From India's Coral Strand.
Okay, I shall go ahead. Since my husband's death, Amma and the children rely solely on the money that I send them. And then, of course, I think of the other children, the charges I took on for the British family who have hired me for the passage to England. I had wet nursed the baby and busied the older children with card games as I kept the Mensahib hydrated with water. This same family, a few days after landing, had thrown me out with nothing but a week's wages. The missionaries found me sitting in an alley, a shabby woolen shawl wrapped around my shoulders as I held out my hand for loose change. The shame of it. They took me to the Aya's home, where other women from India, Malaya, Jakarta, China had been abandoned just like me. It was only then that I realised I was not alone.
It's so shocking when you read the story. I had no idea that this had even happened. This idea of these Ayahs being brought back to England and then effectively dumped. How much research did you base your stories on?
I actually didn't know a lot about my kind of South Asian heritage before starting this project. A lot of people assume I do because I'm Asian and because they assume that you will know a lot about your kind of family history. But my mum never really talked about it. So I took this opportunity to read as many books as I possibly could about the subject. And then I found this book called Asians in Britain, which spans over 400 years of history. So it was just fascinating to find out, that a lot of Asian people we considered to have come over in the 50s and onwards, that actually there was loads of Asian people throughout British history coming to the UK. But also just to find out these little stories. And that was one of the ones that really stood out for me, that these Ayahs who took care of all the children and were hired to come over on these boats would get paid on the way here and then basically abandoned.
One of my favourite stories is the last in the collection, Take Me to the Eastern Museum, and it's written through the perspective of 3 generations of a Bengali family visiting the hall in the present day. And what you see is how interconnected their personal family story is with the hall, but also with British history. Is that something that you stumbled across yourself?
Definitely. The more I researched and the more I dug into the history of this particular property, I realised we're all connected. I mean, that was the legacy of colonialism in a way, is that people from all over the world are connected to these properties and their wealth and their success, sometimes in good ways, sometimes in bad ways. So yes, I definitely wanted to include that, and it definitely reflected how I ended up feeling at the end of the process.
Masoodha Snaith. Her flash fiction will be published as part of the Colonial Countryside project in the spring. Now, there's been a lot of talking in this programme, but not so much making. So we asked BBC Radio Derby's Martin Williams to visit the Museum of Making, where he was let loose in the storeroom to design a map of curiosities for future visitors to find the objects that caught his eye.
I've just walked into what's called the assemblage, the storeroom here at the Museum of Making. It's a vast room with loads of shelves and artefacts beautifully presented on them. There's so much stuff here, and I know that I've got to choose a few objects to include on my map. Where on earth to start, though? Luckily, I have some help. Kat Rawls is here from the Museum of Making. There's so many different things. Where on earth do I start, Kat?
People can be slightly overwhelmed by it. We've organised it with coordinates. We've also organised it in its taxonomy of materials like synthetic, metal, ceramics.
OK, Kat, I know I've got my work cut out here. Lots and lots of items. What do I need to do with them to make my map?
So first and foremost, you need to choose 3 items. Something that you're drawn to, that you find curious. Maybe it's a funny shape. Maybe you wonder what it might be or what it was used for. So choose 3 and then we'll head down to the studios where we'll meet Nick, who will lead you through the map making process.
Hi, I'm Nicholas Wright and I'm working with the Museum of Making to hopefully help you create some Victorian old school type map.
This is the bit where my artistic skills are put to the test. I need to warn you now, Nick, they're kind of non-existent, but I'm going to give it my best shot. I have my 3 items. What do I need to do next?
Well, what I was going to get you to do is I was going to get you to draw a quick map using the tracing paper that we've got here. So you've got a rough outline of the actual whole assemblage plan, and then I'll get you to plot your items onto the map. After that, you'll get to paint the watercolour as well of the items that you've made. And then that could be your map that you can take home with you tonight, or leave a copy for the kids and they can find some of the objects and they can make them later during their versions as well.
broken my pencil. Have you got a sharpener? Oh, thank you. I'm just tracing along the lines now of the assemblage. It's just getting the basic outline, and then I can actually start to create images of the items that I've chosen. The first object I've decided to go with is the Hawk engine. It's just what looks like a tiny little engine, little mini engine with a propeller on the back. It caught my eye because I think it talks an awful lot about the engineering history of Derby. I've added my 2 other drawings to the map, a clock, and I chose the clock because things like timepieces and clocks are so intricate, and the work that goes into maintaining and running something like that. And then I've also gone for a sandcastle which is made from textiles. The textile that's used is used in the manufacture of aircraft, which I thought was really interesting, and I didn't really understand how those two, what in my mind are completely different areas, aircraft making and textiles, combine. But of course they do, and I thought, well, this woven sandcastle was a really fun way of showing that relationship. So that's why I've gone for those. Now I just need to continue with the painting. I think I'm done. Nick, what did you make of my effort?
It's really good. I mean, you've been here for an hour and a half and you've done an impressive job considering you literally knew nothing about what you were doing before you turned up, which is great. Everyone knows something when they finish. They'll be able to do it again. Transferable skills is what we should be about as well.
That was Martin Williams. You can find Martin's map at the Museum of Making the next time you're in Derby. And the music you heard there was Mozart's Violin Concerto No. 4, performed by Derby's Sinfonia Viva as a gift to the city for its support during the pandemic. And that music is available through their website. That's all from Derby. On tomorrow's Front Row, composer James Macmillan on the world premiere of his new piece at the first night of the Proms. Thanks for listening to Front Row. I'm Geeta Pensay and the producer was Ekene Akalawu. The studio manager was Steve Greenwood and the production coordinator was Jack Thomason. And if you heard something you liked, don't keep it to yourself, share that news with others.